Hello and welcome to Sleep Theories. How was your day? What time is it where you are right now? And where in the world are you listening from? I hope you're comfortable. If you enjoy mysteries and chilling stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button for Sleep Theories. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains in 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dytalov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dytalov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dytalov. On January 23, 1959, the Dytalov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dytalov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled The Evening Autoten, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dytalov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means Dead Mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dytalov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first two bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these two friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 meters away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dytalov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dytalov was better dressed than the two under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dytalov, searchers found Zinaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 meters from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dytalov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dytalov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolevatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Mansi people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dytalov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dytalov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Montauk nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dytalov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogorova's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dytalov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dytalov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dytalov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dytalov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dytalov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this: a slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, signs of an attempted bivouac. These are all logical steps. One investigator noted that if the hikers had been less experienced, they might have stayed near the tent, dug it out, and actually survived. But because they were well trained, their ingrained avalanche protocol kicked in, ironically sealing their fate. The more experience you have, the more you fear avalanches, as one expert said, and the Dytalov group's expertise may have doomed them by convincing them to flee when they didn't need to. Avalanche theory could even account for some of the strange injuries. For instance, if a slab of hard snow hit the tent, it might have injured someone sleeping on one side, maybe causing Slobodin's minor skull fracture, or even Thibaut Brignol's fatal one. The severe chest fractures in Dubinina and Zolotaryov could be explained if they fell into the ravine while it was dark, or if the shelter they built collapsed on them with heavy snow on top. A snow cave-in can exert tremendous pressure, similar to an avalanche. In 2021, researchers using computer modelling, aided by animation algorithms from the movie Frozen, oddly enough, showed that under certain conditions a slab of compact snow could indeed break bones like those in a car crash, without leaving much external trauma. This gives credibility to the idea that an avalanche, even a relatively small, delayed one, could have produced the catastrophic injuries seen on some of the hikers. However, the avalanche theory has some notable gaps. For one, the physical evidence at the site didn't scream avalanche. When rescuers found the tent, it was still partly standing and not completely buried in snow. In fact, only a few inches of snow covered the tent, and the hikers' skis, which they'd used as tent poles, were still upright. If a significant avalanche had swept through, the tent should have been torn to shreds and debris scattered, yet much of their gear was in place inside. Additionally, the footprints leading away were clearly visible for hundreds of meters, which suggests that no subsequent snowslide wiped them out. Avalanche skeptics also point out that the slope angle of that mountain, around 30 degrees, was borderline for an avalanche, and the group had camped there without immediate incident. Could a delayed slab really occur hours later? It's possible. Heavy snowfall and wind could gradually overload the slope. The official reinvestigation proposed that a slab avalanche about the size of a car indeed struck the tent after midnight, silently and quickly. It didn't fully bury the tent, but it scared the hikers into fleeing. Still, some experts who have visited the site claim the terrain doesn't show typical avalanche chutes, and that conditions that night, based on weather data, weren't classic avalanche conditions. To address some of these doubts, avalanche proponents have refined the idea with variations. One is that a block of snow, cornice, collapsed onto the tent, creating the illusion and sounds of an avalanche. Another idea is the occurrence of a katabatic wind, a sudden, violent downdraft of cold air, which might have sounded like an avalanche or physically damaged the tent and forced them out. In 2020, Russian investigators were so confident in the avalanche explanation that they officially ruled the Dytalov deaths as caused by an avalanche and closed the case again. Many in the scientific community accept this, and it does fit a majority of the facts in a no-nonsense way. But, crucially, it fails to explain some of the stranger elements. The avalanche theory doesn't really account for the radioactivity, or the reports of fireballs in the sky, or why the government might have been so tight-lipped. For those, we need to consider other paths. Our next path of investigation veers into the Cold War military realm. Remember the context, 1959, deep in the Cold War. The Soviet Union was testing all sorts of weapons and rockets in remote areas. The Dytalov group's route wasn't extremely far from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, where Soviet rockets were launched, and other military testing grounds in the Urals. It's no surprise that people have wondered if the hikers stumbled into a secret military experiment or were unfortunate collateral damage of a weapons test. This theory encompasses a few variants, but the most discussed one is an encounter with Soviet military ordnance, specifically parachute mines or air-dropped bombs. One popular variant of this theory involves Soviet parachute mine tests. In this scenario, the hikers camped on Dead Mountain the night of February 2 unknowingly found themselves in the zone of a secret weapons test. Perhaps the Soviet military was conducting an aerial parachute mine exercise in that area. Parachute mines are explosives dropped from the aircraft, which descend slowly under a parachute and detonate above the ground. The theory imagines that the 9 hikers were woken by loud explosions in the sky and bright flashes. Thinking they were in the middle of a bombardment, or fearing that the explosions might trigger an avalanche, they fled the tent in a panic, some of them not even stopping to put on shoes. In the chaos of fleeing and hiding, a few of the group, the ones by the cedar, died of hypothermia first. The others, desperate to survive, took clothing from the dead and tried to persevere. Then subsequent parachute mine concussions in the air might have caused the horrific injuries to the last 4. In other words, shockwaves from additional explosions could have hit them while they sheltered in the ravine, crushing their bodies internally without leaving external wounds. Exactly the kind of injuries Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignoles had. There are indeed records that parachute mines were tested by the Soviet military in February 1959 in that region. Parachute mines, because they detonate above ground, can produce signature trauma similar to what the Dytalov hikers suffered. Heavy internal damage, minimal external injuries, and potentially burns from the thermal blast. This theory also coincides with the reported sightings of glowing orange spheres in the sky around the time of the incident. For example, another group of hikers about 50 kilometers south reported seeing strange orange orbs floating in the north on the night of February 1st. Local residents, a meteorology team, and even some soldiers later described seeing balls of fire in the sky in February and March 1959 in that area. It's not hard to link these to flares, military aircraft, or descending parachute mines. In fact, Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, wrote in 1959 that his team had reported seeing peculiar flying spheres during their field work, but he said he was ordered by Soviet officials to dismiss those claims and remove them from the report. All of that smells like a cover-up of military activity. A similar military-related idea is the testing of a radiological weapon or secret technology that the hikers became victims of. This is often used to explain the radiation on the clothes and the orange skin and grey hair. Perhaps, as some speculate, the hikers came across radioactive debris from a failed experiment, like a missile stage or a nuclear-powered device, which contaminated them. Or they might have been inadvertently exposed to some kind of chemical agent. One theory even posits they were subjects in a KGB experiment involving a sonic weapon or nerve gas, which caused them to panic and hallucinatively flee. Such ideas are admittedly speculative. For instance, if a radioactive dispersal weapon were tested, it likely would have contaminated all hikers and their gear, not just a couple pieces of clothing. And the skin and hair oddities are more plausibly explained by natural mummification than by radiation. The Soviet Union's penchant for secrecy can also explain the hush-hush handling of the incident. Concealment of information was standard procedure in those days. So while the military testing theory covers a lot, the lights, the internal injuries, the radiation, the secrecy, some of its pieces can be explained without invoking top-secret weapons. Still, proponents of the military theory point out a lot of coincidences that are hard to ignore. Why were investigators carrying a Geiger counter in the first place? Possibly because they already suspected something. Indeed, one of the search party heads was from the Ural Polytechnical Institute's radiological lab. Why did they close the area for 3 years? Because maybe they knew it wasn't entirely safe or wanted no one snooping for debris. And we have the direct testimony of officials like Lev Ivanov, who decades later essentially said he believed a UFO or secret weapon was behind it and that he was pressured to keep quiet. The families too believed the military was involved and the truth was being kept from them. All these suggest that something other than a natural disaster was at play. There's even a darker offshoot of this theory, that some of the members of the group were, in fact, KGB agents on a secret mission. This hypothesis was popularized by a 2013 book from a Russian author, Alexei Rakitin. He suggests that Semyon Zolotaryov and possibly Alexander Kolevatev, or even Yuri Krivonishenko, were working for the KGB, and that the hiking trip was a cover for a clandestine operation. The speculative story goes that these KGB agents were supposed to meet CIA agents on that mountain and hand them fake radioactive samples to lead the Americans astray about Soviet nuclear capabilities. In this spy thriller scenario, something went wrong. Maybe the Americans suspected a setup, or another third party intervened, and the hikers were killed to eliminate witnesses. It sounds far-fetched, but it pulls in some real tidbits. Krivonishenko did work at a nuclear plant, Mayak, and was involved in a nuclear accident cleanup, and Zolotaryov was a war veteran who joined the trip last minute under somewhat unusual circumstances, and he insisted people call him Alexander, not Semyon, which was odd. Additionally, as noted, Krivonishenko and Zolotaryov were buried in closed, prestigious cemeteries, usually reserved for VIPs. Some see this as a silent honour for two men who might have died in service to the state. There's no hard evidence for any of this spy theory, but it demonstrates the lengths to which people will go to rationalise the mysterious elements, like the radiation and Zolotaryov's background. It also underscores that the Dytalov incident occurred in a Cold War context, where espionage and secret operations were everyday business. Could the hikers have seen something like a secret missile test that they weren't supposed to, leading to a KGB cleanup? Some families believed exactly that the hikers saw a secret and were eliminated for it. It's a grave accusation, but in the climate of the time, not entirely unthinkable. Now, let's steer away from human agents and look at a more nature-bound yet unusual culprit, infrasound. This is one of the more bizarre theories, but it's scientifically intriguing. In 2013, American researcher Donnie Eichar proposed that a rare natural phenomenon might have caused the hikers to panic. The idea is that the particular shape of the mountain pass and the wind conditions on February 1st could have created a Kármán vortex street, essentially a pattern of swirling vortices in the wind. These vortices could produce a low-frequency rumble known as infrasound, sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. Humans can't hear infrasound, but we can feel it. At certain frequencies, it can induce everything from anxiety and extreme discomfort to outright terror in people. So picture this. As the wind howled over the mountain that night, it might have begun to generate this sub-audible nightmare. Perhaps around the time the hikers settled into sleep, the air itself started vibrating at just the wrong frequency. Suddenly, some of the group begin to feel extremely anxious or sick. An impending doom sensation washes over them for no visible reason. Maybe someone starts whispering or shouting that they can't breathe, that the tent is closing in, or that something's coming for them. In a mounting panic, but not one caused by anything they can see or fight, they decide they have to get out of the tent. They slash it open and spill into the night, desperate to escape this wave of irrational terror inside. They run down toward the tree line, perhaps not even fully aware of what they're doing, driven by pure panic. According to Eikar's theory, once they got far enough from the mountain's wind patterns, in the shelter of the forest, the infrasound effect would cease. The crippling dread would suddenly lift, leaving the group bewildered at their own behaviour. Now they're outside, in the snow, half-dressed and miles from their tent in pitch darkness, with temperatures plummeting. Regaining their senses, they try to survive the night. They start a fire, they huddle together for warmth, they attempt to build a snow shelter, but it's unimaginably cold and they have practically no gear. In this weakened, exposed state, some of them succumb to hypothermia within hours. Others, more determined to live, press on, leading to that chain of desperate moves we know about. Doroshenko and Krivonischenko staying by the fire until it burns out and they freeze. Dytalov, Kolmogorova and Slobodin trying to stagger back to the tent and collapsing on the way, and the last four retreating into the woods to build a snow cave. In the process of digging that snow cave or wandering in the ravine in the dark, a couple of them fell into the ravine or were caught in a collapse, which would explain the crushing injuries they sustained. It's a grim but cohesive sequence of events, triggered, in this theory, by nothing more than an uncanny natural sound. The infrasound theory is spooky because it suggests the mountain itself essentially attacked the hikers' minds. It requires no human predators, no cover-up, just a quirk of physics and weather conspiring at the worst possible moment. It neatly explains the core mystery of why the hikers fled the tent so irrationally. Notably, when rescuers found the footprints, they observed that the prints were walking, not running, implying the hikers were not being chased by an attacker, but left on their own accord in a state of confusion. This aligns with the idea that they were disoriented, but not in blind panic once outside the tent, because the fear was internal, not from a visible threat. However, skeptics of this theory point out that it's a bit of a speculative stretch. Infrasound effects on humans are documented. For example, it's been noted in cases of supposed hauntings, where low-frequency vibrations cause people to feel uneasy. But it's rare to have a perfect storm like that. Also, we haven't heard of other incidents of infrasound making an entire group go insane with fear. Eikar's theory, while fascinating, relies on a lot of ifs lining up perfectly. Specific wind speeds, specific topography, etc. It remains one of the more creative natural explanations, and importantly, it doesn't require any conspiracy or paranormal event. Whether you find it convincing might depend on how much you trust that a sound you can't hear could spark such madness. From invisible forces, we move to very visible ones, perhaps too fantastical for some, but we have to address it. Could the culprit have been an unknown creature? Yes, I'm talking about the cryptid theory, specifically a yeti or abominable snowman. It might sound like tabloid fare, but it has been seriously floated in discussions about Dytalov. The region has local legends of a wild man of the woods, and even the hikers joked about snowmen in their writings. One of the last photos on a recovered roll of film, frame number 7, is often pointed out. It's a blurry image of a dark humanoid figure among the trees. Some claim this is evidence the group encountered a menk, a Siberian yeti. Could it be that a towering, hairy creature harassed them that night, and they fled in terror? Perhaps it pursued them into the woods and even inflicted the injuries. It's a wild idea, but let's see what evidence or lack thereof exists. Now, the evidence for this is extremely thin. First of all, no tracks of any animal, let alone a giant hominid, were found. Only the 9 hikers' footprints were visible in the area. If a yeti had attacked the tent, you would expect huge footprints or drag marks or signs of a fight like tufts of fur or blood. None were there. The tent was cut open from the inside, not ripped apart by claws. The hikers' injuries, while severe, don't match an animal attack. There were no claw marks, bite wounds, or defensive wounds like you'd see if they were fending off a bear or wolf. And predators in that region, bears, would be hibernating in February. There was one set of scratches on Zolotaryov's body that some thought looked like claw marks, but these were superficial and could easily have been from brushing past tree branches or scraping ice. That said, in the imagination, it's not hard to conjure a scenario. The group is inside the tent when some unknown creature approaches. Perhaps they see a huge shadow or hear a monstrous scream. Local Mansi folklore speaks of a forest giant. In a panic, they cut their way out of the tent and run. In the forest, this creature might have picked them off one by one, or at least scared them into deadly missteps. Dubinina's missing tongue gave rise to stories that a yeti ripped it out, though again, that was likely post-mortem. The radioactivity was even woven into this narrative by some suggesting the creature itself was somehow radioactive, tying into UFO lore. All of this is highly speculative and not supported by concrete evidence. It lives mostly in the realm of TV documentaries and internet forums. American skeptic author Benjamin Radford reviewed the sensational Russian Yeti hypothesis and noted that a simple avalanche, or other natural event, is far more plausible given the lack of real evidence for a monster. Nonetheless, the cryptid theory persists as part of the Dytalov pass law, in part because the mystery has a kind of eerie, wilderness vibe that invites people to think of folk monsters, and indeed, the idea of a cryptid adds a layer of psychological horror. The thought of an unknown, perhaps intelligent predator stalking the 9 hikers in that lonely pass is the stuff of nightmares. But objectively, this theory doesn't carry much weight in the investigation. Speaking of psychological horror, there is another chilling theory that the Dytalov group were unwitting guinea pigs in a secret psychological experiment. This overlaps a bit with the military theory, but it's worth exploring on its own. Perhaps the hikers were intentionally subjected to something, a drug, a device, a situation, to see how they'd react, as part of some dark experiment in human endurance or psychological warfare. Remember, this was the Cold War. Both superpowers did some ethically dubious experiments on people, like the CIA's MKUltra with LSD, or alleged Soviet sleep deprivation experiments. Could the Dytalov party have been dosed with a hallucinogen unknowingly? If, for example, their stove released some toxic smoke or a chemical agent, like aerosolized oleander or some synthesized fear-inducing gas, was tested on them, it might cause disorientation and panic. One kernel that feeds this theory is how swiftly and decisively the Soviet authorities stepped in and then clamped down on information. They sent a lot of manpower for the search, including soldiers and KGB personnel. When the bodies were found, Moscow sent senior pathologists to do the autopsies, which was unusual for a local accident. Some reports say that certain internal organs were removed for secret analysis, though this is contested. And of course the case files were immediately classified. All this hints that perhaps the authorities were tracking something from the start, maybe even expecting something to do out. It's also noted that some of the rescue team members were very tight-lipped or behaved oddly. One student rescuer had a meltdown and refused to ever speak of what he saw at the site. Did he see something more than we know, or was he just traumatized by the gruesome scene? These ambiguous bits of lore feed the experiment theory. One more angle here, sound and light experiments. There's speculation that the hikers might have been victims of a test of a psychotronic weapon, like an infrasound generator, tying back to the earlier theory but making it man-made, or a blinding light weapon. If, say, the military was testing a device that emitted frequencies to cause fear, the hikers would have been perfect test subjects, isolated in the middle of nowhere. Alternatively, perhaps a series of illumination flares or flash bombs were dropped, which might explain the bright lights, not to harm them, but as part of war games, and it scared them out of the tent. There's a lesser-known theory that the hikers might have witnessed some secret parachute mine exercise, and were subsequently deliberately frightened by special forces to get them out of the tent and into the cold, essentially an indirect way to kill them without physical confrontation. This is admittedly extremely conjectural. Consider also, among the 4 hikers found last, 3 had fatal injuries, but 1, Kolovatov, did not. If an incident like an explosion or collapse caused those injuries, Kolovatov either died by other means or lived longer. Some have even speculated, what if one hiker survived longer than we think, or even until the searchers arrived and was silenced? There's no real evidence for that. All 9 were definitively dead when found. But these are the kinds of thoughts that arise when you contemplate secret experiments. Did someone finish them off? Were some of them alive and then disappeared by the KGB? It gets pretty dark. It's a very conspiratorial picture, and honestly it's not strongly supported by the known facts. If this were an experiment, it would rank as one of the cruelest in Soviet history, and for what gain? To see how random students respond to terror? Some argue that maybe certain members, Zolotaryov or Krivonashenko again, were involved in secret work, and the others were just collateral damage in an experiment or operation. It's a tangled web of speculation. The secret experiment theory tries to capture everything: the lights, perhaps flares, the panic induced by something like gas or sound, the injuries from secret tech or staged cleanup, the radiation from experimental material, and the secrecy, obvious if it was classified. It's appealing in that it can explain a lot in one go. But it requires believing that the Soviet state would intentionally sacrifice 9 of its young citizens in such a bizarre way, and then successfully cover it up. Given what we know about Soviet history, it's not impossible. But there's no smoking gun here, only suspicious circumstances and gut feelings. After walking all these convoluted paths, we often end up right back where we started. 9 people went up a mountain and something caused them to never come back. Each theory explains some pieces of the puzzle but not others. Maybe the truth is that multiple factors came together in a perfect deadly storm. In fact, some recent investigators believe the final scenario might have been a combination of causes, a bit of natural force and a bit of human action. For example, perhaps a small avalanche did hit the tent, explaining the initial flight. But there were also military flares or explosions that night, explaining the lights and injuries. Or imagine this: a fierce wind, Infrasound, freaked them out and they fled. Then while huddling in the forest, they got caught in the shockwave of a distant explosion that broke their ribs. There's even a hypothesis that the sound of a Soviet rocket or missile re-entering the atmosphere, a phenomenon known to make a terrifying sonic boom and bright light, panicked them out of the tent, and perhaps debris from that rocket injured some of them. It might not be one single cause. It could have been a fatal cocktail of fear, weather, and unfortunate timing with military tests. Remember, the official Soviet report originally listed cause of death as unknown compelling force. Who's to say that force had to be singular? And yet, there are those damn orange lights in the sky unofficially denied in 59, but confirmed by multiple witnesses later. There's the odd fact that some of the hikers' skin was strangely tanned and their hair grey, which, while likely natural, just feels off in a case like this. There's the troubling statement from a local official to the families: "You'll never know the truth." Perhaps the most haunting thing is what Lev Ivanov admitted in 1990, that his team saw something they couldn't rationally explain, flying spheres, and higher-ups ordered them to keep it out of the report. It makes you wonder, what did the Soviet government think the hikers encountered? Even if it wasn't aliens, and there's no real evidence it was, the fact that seasoned investigators whispered about that possibility tells you how perplexing the case was, even to them. As I finish this investigation, I'm left with a mental image I can't shake. I see the Dytalov group in their last moments, 9 silhouettes moving silently through swirling snow, their thin forms illuminated occasionally by an eerie orange glow from above. I imagine their confusion and fear, the wind whipping their screams away into the darkness. I picture Lyudmila Dubinina, fiercely determined, insisting they keep moving, Igor Dytalov trying to keep the group together, Zina Kolmogorova shivering and praying under her breath, and young Yuri Krivinshenko, perhaps cracking a feeble joke to lift spirits even as his hands turn numb. I see them huddling under that cedar, faces lit by a dying fire, their eyes reflecting something, maybe distant lights in the sky, or the realization that they might not see morning. It's a scene of human vulnerability against the vast, indifferent backdrop of nature, and possibly human machinations. But the story continues to send a shiver down the spine of anyone who hears it. Not just because of what might have happened, but because of the uncertainty that lingers. We are drawn to the Dytalov Pass incident, not just to solve it, but to experience that sense of standing on the edge of the unknown. It makes us wonder about the thin line between the ordinary and the extraordinary. These were smart, capable young people who set out on a skiing adventure, something thousands do, and they ended up in a tableau of death that reads like horror fiction. In the end, after exploring every trail of evidence and speculation, we're left with an unsettling legacy. The Soviet government once concluded that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force, but maybe it was the price of state secrets, as one book title suggested, that cost 9 lives. Perhaps the truth was considered too sensitive, too terrifying, or too embarrassing to reveal. Perhaps it was buried under the snow by design, just like those last bodies were. We may never know for certain. What do you think happened up there in the icy darkness? As you lie there listening, imagine the biting wind, the crunch of footsteps in snow that suddenly stop, and the oppressive silence that followed. Each theory we discussed has its champions and its detractors, and even now, new ideas keep emerging. The Russian authorities reopened the case in 2019 and closed it again with the avalanche answer, but not everyone is convinced. The debate, like the howling wind on Dead Mountain, just goes on and on. 9 lives disappeared into the snow, and decades later the storm hasn't stopped, because whatever happened on Dytalov Pass was never supposed to be found. Some say it's based on classified information that was never meant to reach public ears. Tonight we explore the darkest corners of government experimentation and the thin membrane between dimensions. Daniel Cross bolted upright in his bed, sweat-drenched sheets twisted around his legs like restraints. The dream had returned, more vivid this time. Underground tunnels bathed in pulsing blue light, the cold metal chair, the leather straps on his wrists, and the voices, always the voices, echoing through concrete chambers. Subject 17 demonstrates exceptional receptivity, increased neural amplitude by 30%. His bedroom television flickered with static, though he was certain he'd turned it off before going to sleep. From within the dancing grey pixels came a familiar hum, a sequence of tones just below normal hearing threshold. Something about it pulled at the corners of his mind, like fingers trying to pry open a locked door. Daniel stumbled out of bed and approached the screen, mesmerised. Within the chaos of white noise, patterns emerged, geometric formations that shouldn't exist in random static. His reflection in the screen looked foreign, almost like another person watching him from behind the glass. "Delta Protocol 17, he whispered, the words rising unbidden from some hidden chamber of memory. "Initiate phase bend." The static intensified, the hum growing to an electric whine that made his fillings ache. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the television went black. Daniel stood there, trembling in the dark, wondering why tears were streaming down his face. In the morning, he convinced himself it had been nothing but a particularly vivid nightmare. But as he brushed his teeth, he noticed something unsettling in the bathroom mirror. A small red mark behind his ear, perfectly circular, like a healed puncture wound. He had no memory of receiving it. As the days passed, the dreams intensified. Always the same elements. The underground facility, scientists in lab coats, the chair with its cruel restraints, and tests. Endless tests designed to push the boundaries of his mind. In each dream he was younger, perhaps 11 or 12 years old. But the strangest part was the location that kept appearing in the background of these fractured memories. A distinctive radar tower rising against a darkening sky. When not at work coding security algorithms for a defence contractor, Daniel found himself obsessively drawing the tower, trying to place where he might have seen it before. His apartment walls became covered with sketches, the tower from different angles, the curved coastline it overlooked, strange symbols that his hand seemed to produce without conscious direction. His colleague Martin noticed the change in him first. "You look like hell, Dan," he said over lunch one day. "Not sleeping?" Daniel hesitated. "Just some weird dreams." "About what?" "I don't know. Some kind of facility. Tests. A radar tower by the ocean." Martin's plastic fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What kind of tower?" "An FPS-35, Cold War era, massive thing with a distinctive cowling." Daniel blinked, surprised at his own precise knowledge. Martin set down his fork. "That's oddly specific for a dream." "I know, and there's something else." Daniel lowered his voice. "Sometimes when there's static on the TV I hear something, like a signal." "What does it say?" "It doesn't speak. It's more like a beacon, calling me somewhere." Martin studied him for a long moment. "You ever heard of Camp Hero? Out in Montauk?" The name sent an electric shiver down Daniel's spine. His coffee cup slipped from suddenly numb fingers, shattering on the floor. "Jesus, you okay?" Martin asked, jumping back from the spreading puddle. "I need to go there," Daniel whispered, staring at nothing. "Montauk." The drive to Long Island took 4 hours, but to Daniel it felt like returning from an exile that had lasted decades. As he crossed into the township of Montauk, a pressure began building behind his eyes. Not quite pain, but an insistent awareness, like the sensation before a sneeze that never comes. The roads grew narrower, pine forests pressing in on both sides. His GPS lost signal twice, but Daniel found he didn't need it. His hands seemed to know which turns to take, guiding the car along increasingly remote routes until the trees gave way to scrubland, and beyond that, the Atlantic stretched to the horizon. And there it stood, exactly as he'd drawn it 100 times, the massive radar tower of Camp Hero, its distinctive silhouette rising against the pale blue sky. The abandoned Air Force Base sprawled beneath it, a collection of bunker-like buildings and concrete structures designed to withstand Soviet bombs that never fell. According to the weathered sign at the entrance, Camp Hero was now a state park, its military function long obsolete. But something about the perimeter fence looked too new, the security cameras too well maintained for a simple historic site. Daniel parked in the nearly empty lot and approached the visitor centre, a converted military building with peeling green paint. Inside, a bored park ranger glanced up from her crossword puzzle. "Closing in an hour," she said without preamble. "I was wondering what you could tell me about the history of this place," Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the hammering of his heart. "Standard Cold War radar station, decommissioned in the early 70s. She pushed a pamphlet across the counter. "Self-guided tour maps there. Stick to the marked trails." "What about the underground sections?" The ranger's crossword pencil stopped mid-letter. Her eyes flicked up to study him more carefully. "There aren't any underground sections open to the public, but they exist. Look, mister, this is just an old radar station, if you're one of those conspiracy nuts." "I've been here before," Daniel interrupted, surprising himself. "When I was a child, not possible. This place was sealed military property until 92. Daniel leaned forward. "What about the Montauk Project?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The ranger's face hardened as she set down her pencil and reached for the phone. "Park's closing early today. You need to leave." "I just have a few questions." "Now," she said, her finger hovering over the keypad. "Or I call security." Daniel retreated to his car, the pamphlet clutched in his hand. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he noticed a black SUV with government plates turning in. The man in the passenger seat photographed his license plate as they passed. Instead of leaving, Daniel drove to the public beach adjacent to the former base. From there, he followed a trail that hugged the dramatic bluffs overlooking the Atlantic. The radar tower remained visible above the tree line, seeming to watch him as he walked. When he reached a chain-link fence marking the base's boundary, Daniel felt a strange duality, his conscious mind seeing it for the first time, while something deeper recognized every rust spot and bent link. He knew, without understanding how, that 20 yards to the left, the fence had been repaired where someone had once cut through it. Sure enough, when he checked, there was a section of newer fencing exactly where he'd expected. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Daniel found a secluded spot where the bluff had partially collapsed, creating a natural path down to a narrow strip of beach. The base's concrete seawall extended here, covered in graffiti and eroded by decades of salt spray. He ran his hand along the rough surface until his fingers caught on something, a small recess containing what appeared to be a rusted electrical box. Without hesitation, Daniel entered a sequence of numbers, 8-1-3-5. Nothing happened. He tried again with 8315, and then finally 8153. A deep mechanical groan emanated from within the wall. A section of concrete, expertly disguised as part of the seawall, shifted inward by several inches. Daniel pushed, and it swung open on hidden hinges to reveal a dark passage leading into the earth. The smell that wafted out was a complex mixture of mildew, ozone, and something chemical that triggered an intense wave of déjà vu. Daniel switched on his phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The passage sloped downward, concrete walls giving way to rough-hewn stone that glistened with moisture. Daniel moved cautiously, guided more by buried memory than by sight. After about 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a larger space, what appeared to be an abandoned maintenance room filled with rusted equipment and collapsed shelving. But Daniel knew this wasn't its original purpose. He directed his light toward the far wall, where a heavy metal door hung partially ajar. Beyond it lay darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow his flashlight beam. As he approached the threshold, a wave of dizziness overcame him. Fractured images flashed through his mind. Children in hospital gowns, scientists with clipboards, a massive chair surrounded by electronic equipment, and always, the tests. Focus on the light, Daniel. Tell us what you see through the gateway. His phone slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor as Daniel collapsed. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was a symbol scratched into the metal door, a triangle intersecting with a perfect circle. When he awoke, Daniel was lying on the beach, waves lapping at his feet. The sun had set, and stars glittered in the darkening sky. His clothes were soaked with seawater, though he had no memory of entering the ocean. His phone was gone. And most disturbing of all, the entrance in the seawall had vanished, not just closed, but seemingly never there at all. Daniel stumbled to his feet, disoriented. His watch showed it was just past 9 p.m, but the date displayed was wrong. According to his watch, he had lost nearly 3 days. The drive back to his apartment in Connecticut was a blur, a dream-like passage through darkness punctuated by the hypnotic sweep of headlights. Daniel's mind churned with fragments of memory that couldn't possibly be his, yet felt more authentic than his recollections of college or his first job. He remembered the chair, the Montauk chair they'd called it, a monstrous assemblage of technology salvaged from alien craft and enhanced with Tesla-inspired circuitry. He remembered the sensation when they activated it with him strapped inside, like his consciousness was being pulled through the top of his skull and stretched across dimensions. And he remembered what they made him do with it. Back in his apartment, Daniel paced until dawn, scribbling everything he could recall into a notebook. Names surfaced. Doctor. Marcus Bennett, the project lead with cold blue eyes. Cameron Hayes, the military liaison who always smelled of cigarettes and cheap cologne. And Preston Nichols, the reluctant technician who sometimes snuck the children candy bars when the others weren't looking. Preston Nichols. The name felt important. When morning came, Daniel called in sick to work and drove to the nearest public library. The librarian gave him an odd look when he asked if they had anything on the Montauk Project, but directed him to their small collection of conspiracy literature. There, sandwiched between books on Roswell and MK Ultra, was a worn paperback. The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, by Preston B. Nichols and Peter Moon. Daniel's hands trembled as he flipped through pages describing exactly what he'd been remembering. The secret installation at Camp Hero, the psychic experiments, the Montauk chair, even the alleged success in manipulating the fabric of time and space. According to Nichols, the Montauk Project was the continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, another rumoured government program that supposedly made a naval destroyer, the USS Eldridge, temporarily invisible and teleported it from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia in 1943. The book claimed the Montauk Project had been shuttered after an incident in 1983 when a monstrous manifestation, dubbed the Beast, had been psychically pulled through a dimensional gateway. The creature had wreaked havoc before the power was cut and the project abandoned. But Daniel knew this wasn't entirely true. The project hadn't ended. It had evolved. The techniques refined at Montes had been incorporated into other programs, dispersed across multiple sites to ensure no single failure could expose the entire operation. Back at his apartment, Daniel found himself standing before his closet, staring at a locked metal box on the top shelf. He had no memory of putting it there, yet he knew exactly what it contained. The key was taped underneath his dresser, precisely where some part of him expected it to be. Inside the box was a US Bank safety deposit key. The following morning, Daniel presented himself at First National Bank in downtown Hartford. He provided the key along with his ID, and the manager escorted him to the vault. When they were alone with the metal drawer extracted from the wall, Daniel opened it with a sense of inevitability. Inside lay a manila envelope, sealed with red security tape bearing federal classifications he shouldn't have had access to. He broke the seal and emptied the contents onto the small table. Photographs spilled out, black and white images of children in a sterile facility. In several, Daniel recognised his younger self, perhaps 10 years old, wired to various machines. In one particularly disturbing image, he sat in a massive chair surrounded by Tesla coils and computer banks, his small form almost swallowed by the ominous apparatus. There were documents too, partial research notes, diagrams of the Montauk chair annotated with equations that made his eyes hurt to look at, and a map of Camp Hero with underground sections marked in red. At the bottom of the pile lay a compact disc in a paper sleeve, unmarked except for a date. August 12th, 1983, the day of the alleged Beast incident. Most chilling of all was a typed list of names under the heading Project Subjects Delta Group. His own name appeared with a designation that turned his blood cold. Subject 17, Primary Gate Opener. That night, with shaking hands, Daniel loaded the disc into his laptop. After whirring for several seconds, the screen displayed a single video file. The footage was grainy, security camera quality. It showed a concrete room dominated by the chair he'd been drawing obsessively. A boy, himself, was strapped into it, electrodes attached to his temples. Men in lab coats monitored equipment while military personnel stood guard at the doors. A voice off camera counted down, initiating Delta Protocol in 3, 2, 1. The lights in the facility dimmed as power surged to the chair. Young Daniel's body went rigid, his back arching impossibly as his eyes rolled back. Equipment sparked and smoked. Several technicians backed away nervously. Then, at the centre of the room, the air itself seemed to tear open. a writhing black void that pulsed like a living thing. From within that impossible darkness, something began to emerge. The camera feed distorted violently, static washing across the screen. When the image stabilised, chaos had erupted. People were screaming, running. Blood spattered one of the walls. And at the edge of the frame, partially obscured, was a glimpse of something that couldn't exist in our reality. A mass of shifting geometries and impossible angles that hurt to look at. The final clear image before the video cut to static. Young Daniel staring directly into the camera. Blood streaming from his nose and ears. Mouth moving to form words that seemed addressed to his future self. You have to shut it down before it opens again. Daniel ejected the disc with numb fingers, his mind reeling. Not just from what he'd seen, but from what was happening inside his head. Memories crystallizing, filling in gaps he hadn't known existed. He remembered now. All of it. The next day he called the only person who might understand. The number was etched in his memory, though he couldn't recall ever learning it. "Hello?" The voice that answered was aged, cautious. "Is this Preston Nichols?" A long pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel Cross. I was Subject 17 at Montauk." The silence that followed lasted so long that Daniel thought the connection had been lost. Finally the old man spoke, his voice a haunted whisper. "God help you, boy. They're still watching. I need answers. Not over the phone. They're always listening." Another pause. "The lighthouse. Tomorrow. Noon." The line went dead. Daniel arrived at the Montauk Point lighthouse an hour early, parking his rental car. He'd abandoned his own vehicle, suddenly paranoid about tracking devices, in the tourist lot. The historic lighthouse stood tall against a sky heavy with approaching storm clouds, its red and white stripes a cheerful contrast to the grim purpose of his visit. He spotted Nichols immediately, a heavy-set older man in a worn fisherman's jacket sitting alone on a bench overlooking the Atlantic. As Daniel approached, Nichols didn't turn but spoke as if continuing a conversation already in progress. "They told us we were serving our country," he said, eyes fixed on the churning waves below. "Advancing human potential, opening frontiers. What a load of horse shit." Daniel sat beside him. "You were there. You helped them. And I've spent 40 years trying to make up for it." Nichols finally turned to look at him, his weathered face a map of regret. "Jesus. You grew up. Last time I saw you, you were just a skinny kid with too much power in your head. What did they do to me?" Nichols sighed, reaching into his pocket for a pack of cigarettes. His hands trembled slightly as he lit one. "You were special, even among the sensitives. Most of the children could receive impressions, maybe move small objects, but you could create doorways. Doorways to where? That was the question, wasn't it? At first, they were just focused on remote viewing, psychically observing distant locations. Then they realised some of you kids could not just see, but reach. And you, Daniel, you could open gates that others could step through." The old man took a long drag from his cigarette. "They started small, different rooms in the facility, then different points in time. Just minutes at first, then hours, then years. By 82, they had you opening doorways to other places entirely." "The beast," Daniel said quietly. Nichols' face went ashen. "You remember?" "I found a recording." "Then you know what happened. What came through wasn't from another place on Earth. Not even from another time. It was from somewhere else. Somewhere that operates under different physical laws." Nichols stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary. "We lost 16 people that day before they cut the power. And the thing, it didn't die. It just folded back into dimensions we can't perceive." Daniel's head throbbed with half-formed memories. "They shut it down after that." "Officially, yes. The Montauk Project was terminated, the facility sealed. But you know better, don't you?" Nichols fixed him with a penetrating stare. "They just went deeper underground, compartmentalized. The work continued." but I don't remember anything after that day. I have a whole life. School, college, my job. Artificial memories, very sophisticated. The best MK Ultra techniques combined with targeted chemical therapy. They built you a new identity, brick by brick. Nichols glanced around nervously. The question is, why are you remembering now? The programming doesn't just break down on its own. Before Daniel could respond, his vision split, like a double exposure photograph. Overlaid on the present scene was another image. The same lighthouse, but under clear blue skies, with Nichols wearing different clothes. Happening again, Nichols was saying, his voice echoing strangely as the two realities flickered and merged. The temporal distortions are getting worse. Daniel gripped the bench, nauseated by the visual discord. What's happening to me? Time is bleeding through. Your connection to the Montauk chair never fully severed. It just went dormant. Nichols leaned closer, his face shifting subtly between older and younger versions of himself. Listen carefully. There's an access point they never sealed. Bunker 14 near the old power station. The equipment is still there. You need to... The world around them rippled like disturbed water. A crushing pressure built inside Daniel's skull as reality itself seemed to stutter. When it stabilized, Nichols was gone. In his place sat a teenage boy with a familiar face. Nichols, 50 years younger, wearing a Camp Hero security badge. Find the failsafe before it's too late, the boy continued in Nichols' elderly voice, seemingly unaware of his transformed state. They're trying to recreate the conditions from 83, but they don't understand the danger. The membrane between worlds is thinner now, weakened by the original experiments. The young Nichols flickered and was replaced by the old man again. He clutched Daniel's arm with surprising strength. Go back to Camp Hero, find Bunker 14, destroy the chair before they can use it again. Another wave of temporal distortion washed over them. When it passed, Daniel was alone on the bench. A family of tourists walked by, giving him curious looks as he sat there, pale and shaking. That night, Daniel returned to Camp Hero under cover of darkness. The perimeter fence posed little challenge. He remembered where the security systems had blind spots, knowledge surfacing from decades past. The ranger station was dark and empty. He made his way through the abandoned base, guided by memories that grew stronger with each step. The power station stood silent, its massive turbines long still. Behind it, half hidden by encroaching vegetation, was a small concrete structure with a faded 14 stenciled on its rusted door. The lock had been broken recently. Inside, a metal staircase descended into darkness. Daniel followed it down, the beam of his flashlight illuminating walls that transitioned from concrete to natural bedrock. The air grew colder, charged with an electrical scent that made the hairs on his arms stand up. At the bottom, a long corridor stretched before him. As he walked, temporal distortions intensified. In flashes he saw the corridor as it had been, brightly lit, staffed by busy technicians and armed guards. He heard snippets of conversation from 40 years ago, saw ghostly figures pass through him as past and present overlapped. The corridor ended at a massive vault door standing partially open. Beyond it lay the heart of the Montauk Project, a cavernous chamber housing equipment that should have been removed decades ago. And at its centre stood the chair. Even inactive, it radiated a sense of wrongness, a technology that should not exist, built from principles science had yet to discover. Surrounding it were banks of computers and equipment in various states of repair. Some appeared anciently obsolete, others looked surprisingly modern. Most disturbing of all were the signs of recent activity. Fresh cables ran to newly installed equipment. Toolboxes lay open on workbenches, and a whiteboard was covered with complex equations and a countdown schedule. According to the board, whatever they were planning would happen tomorrow night. As Daniel approached the chair, his consciousness began to splinter. He was simultaneously his present self and his child self, experiencing both timelines at once. In one reality, he stood before the dormant machine as an adult. In the other, he was strapped into it as technicians calibrated its settings. "Good morning, Daniel," said a voice from both past and present. "We've been waiting for you to return." Daniel turned to find Dr. Bennett stepping from the shadows, older now, his hair silver instead of brown, but with the same cold blue eyes. "You," Daniel whispered, "you're still running this. Did you think we'd abandon the most important scientific breakthrough in human history?" Bennett circled him slowly. "Especially after what you showed us was possible. You need to shut this down. You don't understand what you're doing." "On the contrary, we understand far better now." Bennett gestured to the upgraded equipment. "We've spent 40 years refining the technology, studying the data from the original experiments. The incident in '83 was a momentary setback. 16 people died. Progress requires sacrifice." Bennett's voice hardened. "And now you've returned, exactly as our models predicted. The prodigal son drawn back at precisely the right moment." Daniel backed away, moving toward the chair. "I came to destroy it." "You came because you're still connected to it, because on a quantum level, you've never left that chair." Bennett nodded to someone behind Daniel. "Your memories, your independent life, they were never real. Just a holding pattern while your mind matured into what we needed." Too late, Daniel sensed movement behind him. A sharp pain blossomed in his neck as a hypodermic needle sank into his flesh. The room tilted sideways as the sedative took hold. "Welcome home, Subject 17, Bennett said as darkness closed in. "Tomorrow, you'll help us open the ultimate doorway." Daniel awoke strapped to the chair, electrodes attached to his temples and chest. The bunker hummed with power, banks of equipment manned by technicians in white lab coats. Armed guards stood at attention along the walls. His mind felt clearer than it had in days. The chemical fog of suppressed memories finally lifted. He remembered everything now. His childhood, the tests, the growing fear among the scientists as they realized what they'd discovered, and most of all the true nature of what had come through the gate in 1983. Dr. Bennett approached, clipboard in hand. "Consciousness has returned. Excellent. We have limited time before the window aligns." "You can't do this," Daniel said, straining against his restraints. "You saw what happened last time. A miscalculation. The entity was unstable in our dimensional framework." Bennett checked readings on a nearby monitor. "This time we're better prepared. The integration will be controlled." "Integration?" Cold horror spread through Daniel's chest. "You're not just opening a doorway. You want to bring something through permanently?" Bennett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Not something, Daniel. Someone. Or perhaps, more accurately, someone's." He gestured toward a large display screen where images flashed in a rapid sequence. Advanced technology, biological enhancements, weapons beyond current human capability. Our visitors have so much to offer. Knowledge, power, evolutionary advancement. Bennett adjusted a dial, increasing power to the chair. "All they ask in return is a suitable environment, hosts who can withstand the integration process." "They're not visitors," Daniel said, the truth crystallizing in his mind. "They're invaders, and you're giving them the door code." Bennett ignored him, addressing the technicians. "Begin the initialization sequence. Power to 70%. The chair hummed to life, vibrating subtly beneath Daniel. Familiar sensations flooded his consciousness. The stretching feeling, as if his mind were being pulled from his body and extended across unseen dimensions. On monitors around the room, waveforms pulsed and danced. A technician called out readings. Quantum tunneling effect established. Temporal aperture forming. Daniel closed his eyes, focusing inward. They thought they were in control, using him as a tool, but they'd forgotten something crucial, something even he had only just remembered. He wasn't just a key to open the door, he was the doorway itself. In 1983, when the beast had emerged, young Daniel had done something desperate in the final moments. He'd imprinted a failsafe into the quantum structure of the chair, a back door that only he could access. As the power built around him, Daniel reached into that hidden channel, his consciousness expanding beyond the confines of normal space-time. He could feel them waiting on the other side, vast intelligences, ancient and patient, pressing against the membrane between worlds like fingers testing a soap bubble's strength. And they were hungry. "Aperture at 60%, called a technician. "Dimensional breach imminent." Bennett leaned over Daniel, voice low and eager. "Can you feel them? They've waited so long to meet us properly." "Yes," Daniel whispered, his eyes still closed. "I can feel them, but they're not what you think." "Power surge," shouted a technician. "Systems drawing more than input capacity," Bennett whirled. "That's impossible. Check the—" "It's me," Daniel said, his voice oddly calm as blood began to trickle from his nose. "I'm the power source now. I always was." Around the room, equipment sparked and smoked. Lights flickered as power drained from all systems toward the chair. The metal beneath Daniel grew hot enough to scorch his skin, but he barely noticed the pain. At the center of the room, air began to twist and distort, reality folding like origami into impossible geometries. Through the forming aperture came glimpses of a realm beyond human comprehension, vast architectures that defied Euclidean space, entities composed of light and thought rather than matter. "Yes!" Bennett exulted, oblivious to the danger. "It's working!" A technician grabbed his arm. "Sir, the subject's brainwave patterns are altering the protocol. He's changing the coordinates. Override him. Cut direct neural input. We can't. He's bypassed the safeguards." Daniel opened his eyes, now glowing with an inner light that cast no shadows. When he spoke, his voice reverberated with harmonics that made glass surfaces throughout the bunker vibrate. "I'm not opening a door for them to come here," he said. "I'm creating a vacuum, a one-way passage." The aperture grew, swirling darkness shot through with impossible colours. Air rushed toward it in a howling vortex. Loose objects began sliding across the floor. "What are you doing?" Bennett screamed over the maelstrom. "What I should have done 40 years ago!" Daniel's restraint snapped as his body lifted slightly from the chair, suspended by forces beyond conventional physics. "I'm collapsing the bridge between worlds, permanently." The suction intensified. A guard lost his footing and slid screaming into the vortex, his body stretching bizarrely before vanishing. Others clutched desperately at bolted-down equipment. "You'll destroy everything!" Bennett clawed his way toward a control panel. "Only the infection," Daniel replied. "The chair, the technology, the knowledge, everything that came through, everything that doesn't belong in our reality." With a sound like the universe tearing, the aperture expanded to engulf the chair itself. Metal warped and stretched as it was pulled into the void. Equipment imploded, circuitry unravelling at the atomic level as fundamental forces rewrote themselves around the collapsing gateway. Bennett made a final desperate lunge toward Daniel, face contorted with rage. "We were so close!" As the doctor's fingers brushed his arm, Daniel felt a moment of genuine pity. They were never going to share, Doctor. We weren't potential allies. We were cattle. The floor beneath them buckled as structural supports failed. Chunks of ceiling crashed down as the entire bunker began to collapse inward toward the hungry void. In the final moments before consciousness fled, Daniel saw something massive beginning to emerge from the aperture, not entering our world but being pulled back to its own. The beast of Montauk, returning to its native dimension after 40 years of patient waiting in the spaces between worlds. Its vast form registered in his human perception only as impressions, countless eyes, geometries that hurt to comprehend, and a telepathic voice that bypassed his ears to resonate directly in his mind. "You have closed the way. But there are other doors, other keys." As darkness claimed him, Daniel directed one final surge of power into the collapsing gateway, sealing it with his consciousness as the lock. Daniel awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors. Sunlight streamed through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across starched white sheets. His body felt leaden, every movement requiring conscious effort. A nurse noticed he was awake and summoned a doctor. A kindly-faced woman who explained he had been found unconscious on the beach near Montauk Point, severely dehydrated and suffering from exposure. He had been in a coma for 6 days. When she asked what had happened to him, Daniel claimed not to remember. 3 days later, he checked himself out against medical advice. His apartment, when he returned to it, had been searched with professional thoroughness, nothing obviously disturbed, but he could feel the intrusion like a psychic fingerprint on every surface. His computer was gone. So were his notebooks, filled with memories and sketches. In their place sat a slim manila folder containing a single document, a government position offer with the Department of Energy at a salary triple his current one. The message was clear: forget what happened, take the money, live a comfortable life under watchful eyes. Daniel burned the offer and set to work. Over the next week he purchased equipment from various sources: a high-end laptop paid for in cash, specialised broadcasting gear from hobbyist shops, components that could be assembled into a transmission system powerful enough to reach audiences beyond normal channels. In a cheap motel room paid for under a false name, he connected the final wires and activated the system. The setup was crude but effective, capable of piggybacking on existing broadcast networks and digital platforms, inserting his message into the stream of constant information that flowed through modern society. Daniel positioned himself before the camera and began recording. My name is Daniel Cross. Until recently, I was Subject 17 of a classified government program known as the Montauk Project. What I'm about to tell you sounds like fiction. I wish it were. But Montauk wasn't some urban legend. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It is real. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, at the decommissioned Camp Hero Air Force Base in Montauk, New York, the government conducted experiments in mind control, teleportation, and dimensional manipulation. They used children with psychic abilities. I was one of those children. They discovered that the human mind, properly augmented and focused through what they called the Montauk chair, could do more than just bend spoons or read thoughts. It could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Through these experiments, contact was made with entities from beyond our dimension. The scientists thought they were communicating with advanced beings who would share knowledge and technology. They didn't understand what they were really dealing with. These entities, I don't know what to call them except perhaps predators, they wanted access to our world, not to share, not to help, but to colonize, to consume. They found willing collaborators among power-hungry men who didn't understand what they were inviting in. In 1983 there was an incident. Something came through, partially. We called it the Beast. 16 people died, officially. The project was supposedly shut down, but it never truly ended. They just went deeper underground, fragmented the research across multiple black sites. Last week they tried again. They brought me back, their most successful gate opener, to create a permanent doorway between dimensions. But I collapsed the gateway instead, destroying the Montauk chair and sealing the breach. Daniel paused, wiping blood that had begun to trickle from his nose. I don't know how long I have before they find me. The entities can't come through directly anymore, but their influence remains. They've compromised people in positions of power, not through some sci-fi body snatching, but through whispered promises, glimpses of knowledge no human was meant to possess. The technology created at Montauk still exists in fragmented form. The research continues under different code names, different facilities. Watch for signs, unusual military installations, clusters of missing children with unusual abilities, weather anomalies that defy explanation. These are the fingerprints of operations continuing what Montauk began. I'm uploading documentation with this broadcast, images, partial research notes, coordinates of suspected continuation sites. I've hidden additional evidence in secure locations that will be released automatically if anything happens to me. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way you can't explain, pay attention to that feeling. The membrane between worlds has been weakened. Sometimes things slip through, even without a gate as large as the one they tried to create. They made us forget, but memory is a dangerous thing. Daniel leaned closer to the camera, his eyes haunted but determined, especially when it remembers the future. The recording ended there. Daniel uploaded it along with scanned copies of the documents he'd recovered. He used specialized distribution protocols to seed the files across countless servers worldwide. Too dispersed to be completely erased, too widespread to be dismissed as the ravings of a single disturbed individual. As the final upload completed, his laptop screen flickered with static. From within the electronic noise, patterns emerged. The same signal that had called to him from his television weeks ago. But this time Daniel recognized it for what it was. A beacon. Not from them, but from others like him. Children of Montauk, awakening to their suppressed memories, reaching out across the digital void. He wasn't alone. Daniel closed the laptop and packed his few remaining possessions. Through the thin motel curtains, he could see 2 black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of government operatives. They were too late. The truth was out now, propagating through networks they couldn't fully control. His testimony would reach millions before they could contain it, seeds of awareness planted in receptive minds. Daniel sat calmly on the edge of the bed, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. He wasn't afraid anymore. He understood now that what had happened at Montauk had changed him permanently. The powers they had awakened in him hadn't disappeared. They had merely gone dormant, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. As the heavy footsteps approached his door, Daniel closed his eyes and reached out with his mind, searching for the quantum threads that connected all points in space-time. There were other places he could go, other times. After all, he had been their best gate opener. The door burst open. 2 agents rushed in, weapons drawn. They found an empty room, the window still closed and locked from the inside, the bathroom vacant. On the bed lay Daniel's phone, screen displaying a text message addressed to Dr. Bennett. There are other doors, other keys, and now I have them all. 3 days later, on computer screens across the world, a single symbol appeared momentarily before vanishing, a triangle intersecting with a perfect circle. The Montauk Project was never officially acknowledged. Those who spoke too publicly about it suffered accidents or disappeared. The broadcast was discredited, its evidence dismissed as elaborate hoaxes. But something had changed. People began to notice things they'd overlooked before. Children reported strange dreams of underground facilities and tests. Researchers documented unexplained temporal anomalies near certain government installations, and occasionally, in the white noise between radio stations or in the static of untuned televisions, listeners reported hearing a voice, just on the edge of comprehension, repeating the same warning. They made us forget, but memory is a dangerous thing, especially when it remembers the future. Our story is called False Skies, a conspiracy thriller about a government's darkest deception and the whistleblower who exposed it. It imagines a world where the worst terror attack in modern history was not only foreseen, but deliberately orchestrated to spark endless war and funnel billions into a sprawling military-industrial complex. Now, 2 decades later, an unassuming former FBI data analyst named Thomas Keane leaks hidden documents that point to a monstrous betrayal and becomes the most wanted man in the nation. Pursued by a shadowy agency determined to keep the official version sealed, Keane races to share the truth with a public reeling from revelations that might reshape the entire post-attack world order. If you find your eyes growing heavy at any point, that's okay. This story is meant to be richly detailed. Perhaps you'll drift to sleep while pondering how fear can become a profitable enterprise, or maybe you'll stay riveted till the final word, uncovering each layer with breathless suspense. Either way, I hope you come away with new insights into how power, once obtained, can cling fiercely to the shadows. Shall we begin? Then settle in, let your breathing slow, and imagine the flicker of old computer screens, top-secret binders, and a few missing pages that change the course of entire nations. This is False Skies, told in 5 parts, each revealing a deeper rung of the labyrinth. Listen closely. The greatest secrets often hide in the quiet corners of official stories. Thomas Keane didn't feel like a revolutionary when he first pressed send. He was simply a man weighed down by guilt, holding a flash drive stuffed with revelations that haunted him for years. The file name he'd chosen, of Black Dust, gave no hint to the explosive contents. A trove of classified FBI memos, shipping manifests and encrypted communications that, if authenticated, would confirm every darkest rumour about the worst terrorist attack in modern memory. The day of the leak dawned cloudy, ironically anticlimactic for a moment that might reshape history. Keane sat in a dingy motel room near a dusty highway, a battered laptop perched on a wobbly table. The place smelled of stale coffee and regret, but it had functioning Wi-Fi. He checked his secure connection one last time, heart thrumming. With trembling fingers, he uploaded Black Dust to an overseas whistleblower website known for releasing hidden archives. He paused, typed a short note, for the thousands who died and the millions misled. Then he pressed send. Within the hour, that file reached multiple journalists and a global news outlet with a reputation for defying government censors. The outlet's editorial board pored over it, verifying bits of data in a hush of excitement and alarm. By the end of the day, the first breaking story appeared online, overshadowed by disclaimers. Unverified documents claimed to reveal inside plot behind 20-year-old attack. Skeptics rolled their eyes. Conspiracy theorists hailed it as the smoking gun they'd always wanted. Most mainstream media initially dismissed it, an editing glitch, a potential hoax, or AI-generated forgery, the official line insisted. Yet some found the content too consistent to be random fakes. A set of typed memos from high-level intelligence briefings dated months before the attack, discussing the necessity of a catalytic event to unify public support for indefinite overseas campaigns. Detailed logs showed insurance policy expansions on certain tower floors days prior. Even stand-down orders for certain war games suspiciously matched the real timeline. Keane watched from his motel room's flickering TV as a breathless anchor tried to explain the leak, disclaiming that the White House calls it foreign propaganda. He sighed. The official denial had begun. Next would come the manhunt for the leaker. He closed his laptop, stuffed it in a bag and left the motel. Time to vanish. He'd served in the FBI's data analytics wing for nearly a decade, compiling anomaly reports around that fateful day. Step by step, he realized too many coincidences tied private defense contractors, intelligence heads, and financial bigwigs, all who profited from the subsequent wars. He quietly copied reams of old files, awaiting the day he had the courage to blow the whistle. That day had come. Elsewhere, powerful was mobilized. The intelligence community's upper echelons recognized the name Thomas Keane from previous security audits. They suspected him. Within hours, calls went out from a hush-hush division to find him, brand him as a threat to national security. The director of an ultra-secret agency, Eldridge Shaw, personally oversaw the containment plan. He believed the official story must remain unchallenged, or the entire post-attack order might unravel. By midnight, bulletins labelled Keane suspected hacker and domestic threat. Agents started combing digital footprints, scouring camera feeds from near the FBI building. Shaw himself made a call to a contact at the large media conglomerates, instructing them to bury coverage of the story until further notice. The compliance was near instant. Mainstream news gave minimal airtime to the leak, overshadowing it with other headlines. But the genie was out of the bottle. On social media, the hashtag #BlackDust soared, with amateurs dissecting every memo line. A few data experts cross-referenced the IP addresses in the communications, linking them to known government subdomains. Even the partial revelation stunned the public. If the documents were genuine, it implied that some element within the US establishment not only predicted but abetted the terror event, ensuring maximum casualties for maximum political effect. The phrase false skies emerged, referencing how the public's reality had been manufactured like a painted ceiling above them, concealing the real orchestrators. Within a day, small protests flared outside federal buildings in major cities. People demanded clarity. The government's official statement repeated the forgery or foreign propaganda claim. That evening, hackers with anarchy streaks threatened to leak more verifying files if the mainstream media didn't pick it up. Tensions soared. Meanwhile, the stock market wobbled as rumours of insider deals from decades prior re-emerged. Some corporations connected to military contracting faced plunging shares. Keane watched from a safe house now, a friend's abandoned cabin in the woods. He had only the radio for news, and the swirl of distrust and fury filtered through the static. He dreaded how quickly the establishment might label him a traitor. Indeed, the next morning the FBI publicly named him as a prime suspect in a mass leak of classified data, painting him as an extremist. His old colleagues, uncertain, gave no comment. But behind the scenes, many believed the documents might be real. After all, they recognised Keane's skill in combing data for anomalies. Among the swirl stood a figure named Sarah Voss, an investigative journalist blacklisted from major networks for challenging official 9/11 narratives in the past. She recognised the pattern in these newly leaked documents. They matched puzzle pieces she'd glimpsed in hushed conversation with insiders. She reached out to the new site that hosted the files, leaving an encrypted message. "I can help verify. Let me speak to the source." That message eventually found its way to Keane via an online confidant, setting the stage for an alliance that might shake the entire narrative. Thus, from a dusty hideout, Keane typed a coded reply. The story's real race began. Could he deliver evidence to a credible journalist and blow the entire false narrative wide open before the apparatus of Homeland Security, the very system built on the official source, crushed him? The next step would be forging that alliance with Voss and hoping her instincts for truth outweighed her fear of retribution. For if the government's darkest deception was about to be exposed, those who profited from war would not hesitate to silence him, or anyone else, to keep the official illusions intact. 2 days after the leak, the national conversation roiled in confusion. Official channels insisted the Black Dust documents were an elaborate hoax. Yet smaller media sites posted side-by-side comparisons with legitimate CIA or FBI formatting, showing consistent digital footprints. The public found itself caught between an official narrative and a swirling impetus to question everything. Some believed wholeheartedly in the new revelations, others recoiled or felt threatened by the idea that the last 2 decades of conflict might have been orchestrated. Thomas Keane was already on every national watch list. He'd been a mid-level FBI data analyst until 2 years prior, known for thoroughness, but also for quietly raising flags about inconsistent intelligence reports pre-9/11. The day he left the bureau, no one suspected he'd spent months copying old files slated for permanent seal. Now his old supervisors told the press that he was mentally unstable, harbouring extremist theories. They withheld mention that those same theories had nearly led to internal inquiries years ago, until higher-ups quashed them. In a suburban neighbourhood outside the capital, a black SUV pulled up to a modest house. 4 men in plain suits stepped out. They were from a specialised domestic counter-intel unit, effectively an arm of the Black Archive, a covert group rumoured to be tied to intelligence and corporate interests. They forced the occupant, a middle-aged data engineer who once worked with Keane, to open his home computer. They rifled through his messages, seizing any mention of Thomas or black dust or files. This was repeated across multiple homes of ex-FBI colleagues, all without official warrants. The Watchers answered to a higher chain, operating in the shadows. Director Eldridge Shaw, head of a new consolidated intelligence agency formed after 9/11, presided over these manhunts from a sleek government tower. He remembered the day of the attacks vividly, the chaos that allowed the Patriot Act and massive expansions of surveillance. He'd advanced quickly by endorsing these expansions and forging alliances with top defence contractors. Now, seeing the leaked docs threaten that entire architecture, Shaw was determined to snuff out the source. Reeve, or Keane, whatever his name is, must be found, he told subordinates. We cannot let fantasies unravel 2 decades of progress. As the manhunt escalated, Keane lurked in the outskirts. He recognised the checkposts on highways, the routine scanning of licence plates. He switched vehicles, used an old identity pass, and avoided all major city centres. He survived on snack bars and occasional small store purchases with cash only. At night, he found a cheap motel, paying in a borrowed name. Every moment felt like it might bring a black SUV squealing into the lot. The tension weighed on him, gnawing at his nerves. Sarah Voss, the investigative reporter, finally established contact with him through a secure chat app. "We need to meet," she wrote. "I can help verify these files properly. People trust me to an extent in the alternative media sphere. We must do it soon. The window is closing." Keane hesitated, knowing any in-person meeting risked being traced. But if they never took that risk, the documents might remain in a swirl of unverified rumour, easy for the mainstream to dismiss. They arranged a rendezvous in a small coastal town's library after hours. The next day, as Keane approached the library, he spotted an unmarked sedan idling in the parking lot. Fear pricked him. Watchers might be tailing. To confirm, he looped around the block. The sedan didn't move, possibly just a random visitor. Summoning courage, he stepped inside. Voss, a tall woman with a worn leather jacket, recognised him from the scattered photos circulated in the media. They sat in a corner among dusty shelves. She offered a handshake, voice calm but urgent. "Thomas, I believe you. The official story has always had holes. Let's finalise the proof so we can break it wide open." Keane exhaled relief, sliding a small USB drive across the table. "This is a more complete set than what was posted. Contains direct memos about the stand-down orders, the deals with defence contractors, the flight path manipulations. Also internal emails referencing the hijackers as assets gone rogue." He paused, tears flickering in his eyes. "They used the tragedy for indefinite war, Sarah. They let it happen, or worse, engineered it." Sarah's breath caught. She skimmed a few files on her laptop, eyes widening at references to bank accounts, coded references to Operation Silence. She nodded. "This is explosive, but we need a big platform, enough to force coverage. If we just post it on my blog, they'll discredit or block it. We'll get shut down." She explained a plan. Find a mainstream journalist with a rebellious streak, or do a well-publicised live event that too many watchers can't black out entirely. Suddenly, a muffled scuffle at the library entrance startled them. A figure in dark clothes peered in, Keane tensed. Sarah pressed the laptop closed. They ducked behind shelves as footsteps approached, but the library's old caretaker bumbled out, greeting them obliviously. The suspicious figure, glimpsed through the glass, retreated. Possibly a false alarm, possibly a watcher verifying the location. They parted ways quickly, agreeing to meet again in 48 hours near a major city, planning an infiltration of a local news station that might still allow an unfiltered broadcast. Danger soared. If watchers caught wind of their plan, they'd likely come down with lethal force. That evening, Keane received a frantic text from a friend who had once helped him interpret old FA logs. "One of our guys is dead. A boat accident. They're picking us off." The message cut short. Keane shuddered. The watchers had begun eliminating secondary sources who could confirm the leak's authenticity. He realised the ephemeral window for truth was closing. On the streets, protests flared up as rumours swirled of official foreknowledge. Some saw it as disrespectful to the memory of the victims. Others believed the truth must come out no matter how painful. The government, for its part, ramped up a rhetorical war on misinformation. Director Shaw delivered a short, ominous address, vowing that domestic agitators spreading baseless conspiracies will be brought to justice. Among the swirling chaos, Sarah discovered partial references in the documents to a deeper archive. The Saturn Files, an intelligence ledger tracking post-attack financial flows from official budgets to clandestine owners. If they found that ledger's location, they could show the money trail behind the war expansions. That might be the final nail in the coffin of the official story. They needed it, but time was short. Thus the manhunt overshadowed all. Helicopters roamed certain highways, random car searches increased, and the populace grew uneasy, sensing the government's fear that the leak might be real. Keane ducked from motel to motel, adopting new disguises. Soon, though, his luck would run out, or he'd have to risk a direct showdown, trusting the thunder of public outrage to keep him alive. Little did he realise, the watchers were about to tighten the net, deploying a Black Ops team to ensure the leak never reached unstoppable momentum. If Keane couldn't outmaneuver them long enough to break the final evidence, the official illusions would remain intact. If he did, though, the entire structure of post-attack governance might collapse. The next moves would determine everything. The following week saw Thomas Keane evading watchers by day and collaborating with Sarah Voss by night, each meeting more urgent than the last. They discovered references to the Saturn Files scattered in older CIA memos. Allegedly, it was an encrypted database that meticulously traced the money funneling to defence contractors, oil conglomerates and political campaigns in the immediate weeks after the catastrophic event. If authentic, it would confirm the real motive behind the orchestrated false flag: indefinite war and profiteering. At a safe house borrowed from an old contact of Sarah's, they pored over these hints by lamplight. Among the digital shards was a location clue: a retired NSA facility on the outskirts of a southwestern desert, defunct but rumoured to store old backups. "We find that offline archive," Sarah said. "We can copy the Saturn Files in raw form. That's the smoking gun." Keane nodded, though dread of infiltration weighed on him. Between them, they had minimal resources: a battered car, a few $1,000s in cash, and a handful of laptops. The Watchers, on the other hand, had near limitless means: drones, infiltration teams, access to every camera feed in the nation. But the Watchers didn't fully expect them to attempt a break-in at a presumably abandoned facility, so maybe the element of surprise worked in their favour. Director Eldridge Shaw ramped up the clampdown. The official narrative shaped the public mind. A rogue ex-FBI analyst has unleashed foreign-forged documents aimed at undermining national security. Many believed it, but a growing minority saw government overreach, especially after multiple suspicious accidents claimed the lives of other potential whistleblowers. People asked, if it's so false, why chase and kill so aggressively? In one instance, a known data archivist was found shot in his home, with the press labelling it a botched robbery, ignoring the data archivist's link to the leaked material. On social media, black dust soared. Some city squares erupted in protest, carrying signs that read "We deserve the truth" or "Stop killing our whistleblowers." The Watchers responded by intensifying arrests, calling them rioters. Keane tried to remain focused. He realised that if the Saturn files were real, it might show direct bank transfers from major corporate boards into the pockets of certain officials, all tied to legislation passing huge war budgets after the false flag. That would upend the entire post-attack establishment. No wonder they're stopping at nothing, Sarah murmured. Securing fake IDs, they travelled cross-country by back roads. Each motel they used for a single night, paying cash. They dodged major highways, suspecting license plate readers. The Watchers likely guessed their aim was to expose more data, but might not know the exact target. Meanwhile, the tension between them soared. The climate was near police state. Newscasts repeated that the domestic terrorist Thomas Keane must be turned in. Civilians were promised big rewards for tips. Billboards with Keane's face popped up along highways. He wore a baseball cap and used tinted glasses, but each day was a dice roll. A near encounter. On a lonely stretch, a black SUV sped behind them. They recognised the pattern. Sarah swerved onto a side route, forging through a small farmland path. The Watchers gave chase. Shots rang out, blowing a tyre. The car careened into a ditch. They scrambled out, hid among tall corn. The Watchers searched, but eventually gave up, presumably to avoid a big scene. This brush with violent capture left them rattled, but also more resolved. "We're obviously on the right track if they're that desperate," Sarah said, breath shaky. Finally, after days, they reached the deserted perimeter of the old NSA outpost. It was ringed by a crumbling fence, a few rusted signposts. By the look of the cracked asphalt and weed-choked yard, it had been abandoned for over a decade. Perfect place to bury secrets. Under twilight, they found a corner of the fence cut open by looters. They slipped inside quietly. The main building rose in silhouette, windows boarded up. A stray coyote howled in the distance, wind carrying a faint metallic whistling from open vents. Inside, dust-coated floors. Old cubicles sat in disarray. They used flashlights to navigate. Eventually they located a sub-basement with battered computer racks. A few beeped faintly with emergency power. "There's power? That's suspicious," Keane muttered. Indeed, it suggested the Watchers might still be pulling some data from here. They approached a locked door labelled Server Vault Archive 6. With Sarah's phone, they scanned a partial code from the documents, generating a bypass sequence that might override older system locks. After multiple tries, a green light flickered. The vault door clunked open. Inside the vault, rows of drives and reels lined metal shelves. Dusty but humming with minimal climate control. They sifted through labels: Operation Cast Peak, Post-K-War Roster, Saturn. That was it. A battered cluster of servers with the word Saturn FSV. They carefully powered one terminal, hooking it to a laptop. Sarah typed a root command. The screen glowed. Restricted. Saturn 1, 2, 3. Enter pass. They tried typical keywords from the docs. On the third attempt, a beep. Access. They were in, files scrolled, each referencing massive funding authorizations, building demolitions, insider trading, logs dated within days of the big attack. The scope was monstrous. It implicated high-level bureaucrats, big banks, and even a few journalists. They orchestrated the tragedy to galvanize fear, pass endless war budgets, feed the arms economy, Sarah whispered, stunned. All hidden under national security drapery. Some lines suggested hijackers were known assets used as a controlled ignition. The betrayal was staggering. In that hush, footsteps upstairs. The Watchers had arrived, no doubt detecting the power usage. "We must copy this now," Keane said, launching a data transfer to multiple external drives. Meanwhile, Sarah prepared to kill lights and hide, but the Watchers rushed down, flashlights slicing through gloom. Gunfire echoed. Bullets pinged off server racks. Sarah huddled behind a console, returning fire with a small pistol she carried. Keane initiated an upload, hooking the server to a secure satellite link via a portable router. The Watchers advanced. He typed frantically. the progress bar inching along, transmission at 10%. Then Director Shaw himself stepped in. "Stop!" he roared, voice reverberating in the metal corridor. "Keen, you have no idea what you're unleashing. The stability of entire alliances depends on burying that day's complexities." Shots resumed. Sarah took a graze to her shoulder, but kept the watchers pinned. The bar reached 50%. Shaw barked an order to lob a small explosive. They tossed a flashbang. The ear-shattering pop disoriented them. The watchers closed in, tackling Sarah. Another pinned Keen. The laptop screen cracked under a boot. The upload froze at 80%. In the struggle, Keen twisted free, smashing a guard's face with the laptop, which ironically forced the laptop back to life. The watchers tried to pull cables. Meanwhile, a stray bullet hit a server coolant line. Steam hissed. The infiltration team realized this was too risky. The entire place might go up. Shaw advanced on Keen, gun raised. "You can die here with your illusions, or you can vanish quietly. The truth will never see daylight." Suddenly an explosion from the coolant line triggered a chain reaction in the old power system. Fire licked the corners, sending watchers scrambling. Sarah crawled to safety. Keen, battered, saw the upload bar at 98%. He roared in defiance, pressing a final keystroke to confirm. The system beeped success. The watchers realized the data had been sent out, unstoppable now. Furious, one aimed at Keen's chest. A final shot rang out. Darkness overcame him. The watchers yanked the cable, but it was too late. The Saturn files had presumably reached a safe node on the open web. Alarms beeped. The facility's meltdown forced a hurried retreat. In the swirling smoke, Sarah was dragged away by an explosion's concussive wave. The watchers grabbed Shaw, retreating. The entire sub-basement collapsed in flame and dust. For all they knew, Keen perished under the rubble. But the watchers had lost the bigger war. The Saturn files were free. Within hours, a torrent of new evidence, the Saturn files, flooded the internet. Anonymous activists, archivists, and journalists worldwide mirrored the data. Even as official agencies tried to block or discredit it, the story soared across social media, overshadowing government censorship efforts. Original documents codenamed Operation White Dawn, some Project Switchboard, commissioned for Filter some Rossi, provided stark details. Insider collusion with extremist groups, advanced planning to ensure that attacks triggered panic and indefinite war mobilization, international reaction. Allies demanded urgent clarifications from Washington. Rival nations called for an emergency UN session. The general public, seeing internal memos where top officials weighed acceptable civilian losses for strategic advantage, reeled in fury. Large-scale protests ignited in multiple capitals. People demanded resignations. The entire intelligence apparatus faced the biggest crisis of legitimacy since the day it was formed. Meanwhile, the White House insisted the documents were tampered forgeries, but the mass of cross-corroboration was overwhelming. Anonymous data scientists validated digital signatures, timestamps, usage logs consistent with 20-year-old records. Even some mid-level intelligence employees, shaken by the revelations, publicly confirmed the authenticity. Back home, in the US, the meltdown was immediate. Rallies erupted outside major government buildings, calling for arrests of those named in the files. Corporate board members from arms manufacturing companies faced lawsuits. The stock market dived, particularly for defense sector stocks. Over time, entire boards resigned, some fleeing the country. Various retired generals disclaiming involvement or giving partial confessions fueled headlines. The public found itself torn between anger, betrayal, and heartbreak, reliving the trauma of that fateful day under a horrifying new lens. Media torn. Some mainstream outlets quickly pivoted, acknowledging the new data as genuine after initial attempts to bury it. High-profile anchors apologized for previously parroting the official story. Others doubled down on patriotic narratives, ironically fueling further distrust. The swirl of disinformation versus actual data soared. but the raw evidence was too extensive to suppress. "You can't close the barn door after the horses fled," the commentator said. "The entire architecture of post-attack policy is under question." Director Eldridge Shaw attempted a grand press conference to reassert authority, but the crowd drowned him in jeers. Calls for congressional hearings soared. In a last-chance effort, Shaw's office declared a national security emergency, urging martial law to keep order. That, ironically, only inflamed dissent. Certain states refused to cooperate. Over the next weeks, the old alignment of power began fracturing. Investigations launched from multiple angles, with newly emboldened lawmakers prosecuting those who orchestrated the post-attack expansions for personal gain. Sarah Voss emerged from the southwestern fiasco battered but alive. She revealed how Watchers had infiltrated that abandoned NSA site, how Keane died a hero finalising the upload. She published a moving column titled "One Man's Last Key Press," describing how, in a swirl of gunfire, Keane completed the Saturn files transmission, ensuring no one could bury it. The piece went viral, shaping the public's view of Keane as a tragic whistleblower who gave everything for the truth. At the local level, families of 9/11 victims demanded new trials. The old official commissions were discredited. People realised entire reams of contradictory evidence had been sealed. Even the original investigators admitted they'd been misled or threatened. The emotional toll soared once more. Many felt as though they'd been lied to for decades about the biggest national tragedy. A wave of introspection overcame the country. How had fear become so profitable, and how did good people allow it? Internationally, alliances that had supported the war on terror felt betrayed. Some withdrew forces from contested regions. Others launched their own parliamentary investigations, suspecting shared complicity. The world order that was shaped after the attack started crumbling, replaced by an uncertain future. Some dared to hope it meant a less militarised approach. Others worried that new extremist groups might exploit the chaos. In the midst of all this, rumours circulated that Thomas Keane might still be alive, sightings in some far-off place, yet no concrete proof existed. Official statements considered him presumed deceased. If he survived, he might have chosen the anonymity of an unknown identity, having done what he set out to do. 6 months later, a massive Senate hearing convened. Top officials were subpoenaed. The public watched enthralled as ex-generals, ex-CEOs, and ex-administration figures from 20 years prior faced grilling. Some invoked national security, others pled the fifth, while a few confessed partial roles. Indictments followed, though not all ended in convictions. The system was too vast, too intricately rigged. Yet the symbolic effect was undeniable. Never again would the official story be accepted unchallenged. At the same time, Sarah Voss launched an independent media platform broadcasting daily updates on the False Skies Inquiry. People from across the spectrum contributed testimonies, documents, or personal stories of how they'd suspect hush-ups. Freed from blacklists, she soared as a public figure, championing the cause of government accountability. A year after the Saturn Files meltdown, a new memorial was erected near the site of the original 9/11 tragedy. A statue depicting a single figure pressing a key, a reflection of Keane's final act. The inscription read, "They took truth from us in the shadows, he brought it back in the light." Visitors left flowers, some seeking solace that the realm of power had at least partially been unmasked. Epilogue. In a quiet coastal town, a fisherman swore he recognised a man from a circulated photo. Older, hair bleached by salt and sun, eyes weighed with sadness. The man told him he used to work for the government, but no more. He spoke of illusions and the cost of unveiling them. Then he vanished at sunrise, leaving only a single battered flash drive behind. If it was Thomas Keane, he apparently chose a wandering fate, letting the world handle the legacy of his bombshell leak. Public trust in large institutions remained shaken. Some remained furious, others hopeful that a new transparency might arise. In the corners of the internet, conspiracy watchers debate if the watchers still exist, planning new false flags. But for now, the greatest deception in modern times has been laid bare. The name Black Dust stands as a testament to the unstoppable power of truth once it's unleashed. In the hush that follows, the final note, they used fear to shape the world, but one day fear lost. The truth soared free, and the illusions that once cloaked the skies were shattered in a single day.